seriously? Do you know who I am? I laughed incredulously at my therapist. 10 years ago, I found myself sat in front of yet another therapist for depression symptoms. She smiled and repeated, "I think you have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder." But how can I? I'm a doctor, I'm not a soldier, I've not been to war. At medical school, I was taught that PTSD or trauma were to do with war, combat, big catastrophic events, none of which applied to me. The therapist gently reminded me of the sexual assaults that I had just told her about, events that I had told countless other therapists, doctors, even a psychiatrist, but not a single one had validated my experiences or told me that they were not my fault. This therapist was the first person to acknowledge that what had happened to me was trauma. She helped me join the dots between the shame and physical symptoms that I lived with daily and the awful experiences that had happened years before. At 16, my friends didn't notice that I'd fallen behind and become surrounded by a gang of men who handcuffed me to a fence. At first, I pretended to find it funny like they did, then tried to convince them to let me go, and was only saved by the sound of a nearby police siren. That day, I learnt that I couldn't rely on anyone to look out for me. At 18, I was traveling and met a guy who came on to me, trying to unbuckle my belt. When I tried to push him away, he strangled me. I froze. I was completely unable to fight back, to run away, to even scream. That day, I learnt that I couldn't trust my body or my voice. At 19, I was working in a bar and met another guy, and despite being very clear and telling him that I did not want to have sex with him, he raped me. When I told our boss, the landlady, she laughed. She said, because I had worn a skirt, danced, and had a drink, I was asking for it. That day, I learned not to speak up. It just felt safer not to trust anyone. I now know that my responses were physiological, whole-body responses to threat. My fawning or submission, freezing and playing dead were, in fact, survival strategies that all animals do in response to trauma. But at the time, I thought they just proved I was weak. I turned the judgment and blame inwards, completely believing it was my fault and that I had deserved it. And my story is not uncommon. According to the Office of National Statistics, 1 in 4 women in England and Wales over the age of 16 experience sexual assault or rape in their lifetime, half of them more than once. And of those who are raped, only 1 in 6 report this to the police. Sexual violence and war aren't the only potential causes of trauma. Things like being bullied as a child or an adult, or emotional abuse, bereavement, even seeing the abuse and suffering of others, these can all cause invisible wounds. But so often when we do try to speak up, we're told that it didn't really happen, or you're overreacting, you're too sensitive, or that we are to blame. And when trauma isn't acknowledged, shame thrives. And shame doesn't just disconnect us from ourselves and our intuition, but from everyone around us. And we can think that when we disconnect, we can forget it. But actually, what's happening is those often hidden injuries are just getting pushed down deeper into our bodies and psyche. And it is that which is devastating to our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. For me, outwardly, I looked like I was fine. But for anyone who understood trauma, the signs were clear. I had moods that were just all over the place. The response I got, just take antidepressants. I was utterly exhausted all of the time. The response, you're burning the candle at too many ends. I had agonizing, really heavy menstrual periods, an awful PMT, premenstrual tension, and I had constant paralyzing suicidal thoughts every month. The response? Cheer up and get a boyfriend. And when I had tried all medication that was on offer, I was told to choose between getting pregnant and having a hysterectomy. Wow, great advice, right? I didn't do those. So instead, I went into medicine to become a doctor. I think subconsciously I was trying to find some kind of answers. But unfortunately, at medical school, we weren't taught that our bodies can carry these invisible scars from trauma that happened years ago. We weren't taught that what starts out as survival strategies then can get stuck in overdrive, which can lead to chronic stress, and that in turn can lead to inflammation. And this means that trauma can affect us at a cellular level. So yes, it can increase the risk of poor mental health, but also increase the risk of things like autoimmune diseases, heart problems, and even cancer. And we certainly weren't taught that cultural and societal factors like racism and poverty also are potential causes for trauma. So the question that I have for you is this. How can we actually heal trauma if we can't even acknowledge that it exists? The problem is that many of us in healthcare are in fact wounded healers. We come into medicine with exactly the same statistical risk of experiencing a traumatic event as everyone else. But then we go on to witness abuse, adversity, and suffering every single day, usually with no support, no space to process, and a culture that teaches us to stay detached. Of course, it's an incredible privilege to be a doctor, but just because we chose this profession doesn't mean that we're superhuman. We are immersed and surrounded by suffering and pain daily. Surely responding to that emotionally is normal. Unfortunately, within medicine, that's often deemed wrong and unprofessional. I was told that I was too emotional for asking who the person was behind the cadaver we dissected for anatomy. I was told I was weak when I said I needed to take a moment after telling the family of an elderly patient who was the spitting image of my own grandmother that they had arrived too late and she had just died from a brain bleed. And I was told to get another career when I admitted I had cried after a young mother had clung to me, begging me to stop her dying from cancer so she could see her kids grow up. If we can't acknowledge our own trauma as clinicians, how can we possibly recognize it in our patients? And trauma doesn't affect just doctors and patients. Impacts of ignoring trauma ripple out through every facet of our society. We know that for children, experiencing abuse or even seeing it in the house where they grow up impacts their ability to form healthy relationships, their ability to learn, and to reach their potential. For adults too, these invisible wounds impact how we communicate in every relationship, whether that is personal, professional, and it also impacts our ability to be creative, to take risks, even how we can ask for help or support. The human cost of ignoring trauma is vast, but if that isn't enough to drive change, then consider the financial cost. A 2022 paper published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry stated that in the United States, people with a diagnosis of PTSD cost $232 billion per year. And that was data from 2018, pre-COVID. But remember, trauma can be healed. However, that healing does begin with a choice. It's the choice to recognize these invisible wounds, to create trauma-informed systems in healthcare, in education, in our justice system, and in our workplaces. People often worry that acknowledging trauma or healing trauma needs to be really complicated or expensive, but I disagree. I like to keep things simple, so I created a framework. I took what had helped me in my own healing journey and blended that with neuroscience, functional medicine, and coaching principles to create the C-Sense framework. So how does this work? Well, there are 5 elements of safety, embodiment, nourishment, structure, and environment. And these are held within a lens or mindset of compassion and curiosity. So when somebody responds or reacts in a way that we don't quite get, rather than judging them and saying, "What's wrong with you?" or "It's all in your head," we can instead pause and ask instead with compassion and curiosity, "What happened to you?" Safety is about being curious when, where, and with whom we feel safe and how that feels in our body. So tension and stress feels kind of like a tightening and a constriction, whereas safety feels more open and expansive. And when we're aware of that, then we can consciously create more pockets of safety in our daily life. Embodiment is about acknowledging that trauma lives in the body, and so noticing how we experience emotions and tension and where we kind of feel that in our bodies, and then letting those sensations move through us in any way that feels right, whether that is dancing or drumming or running or yoga, and then coming back to stillness with things like breath work and meditation. Nourishment is about nourishing our bodies, our minds, and our souls. It's about prioritizing sleep and healthy food and creativity and really doing things that light us up and saying no to that culture of push until you drop. Structure is about creating routines and rhythm and boundaries. That predictability in our daily life helps create a sense of internal safety. Finally, environment is both about being out in nature and acknowledging that our surroundings, whether they are work or home, deeply impact how we feel. And so creating and designing spaces that heal. The key here is pacing. Healing hasn't got a time frame, and sometimes we have more energy for this kind of work and some days less. And that's fine. This is not about perfection. This is about consistency and showing up with compassion for ourselves, using the C-Sense framework as a foundation for healing. And sometimes, for some, that's enough. There's one patient I'll never forget. Let's call her Kate. I remember when I met her, it was a sunny morning with sunlight streaming in through the window. It was in spring. And when she came in, when I saw her, I could feel this hopelessness. And it was like all of the warmth and light was sucked out of the room. She sat, eyes down, body wound up like a wounded animal. So I slowed down, I softened my voice, and I just listened with curiosity and compassion. And she started to speak. I was then able to say words to Kate that she had never heard before, to acknowledge that what had happened to her as a teenager was sexual assault, rape, and to clearly tell her this was not her fault. In that moment, I could see something shift. Her shoulders dropped and she looked up at me, and her body visibly uncoiled in front of me. You see, when she was a teenager, rather than believing her, her family had blamed her and shamed her. So Kate had internalized this and buried it down, and it had led her on a path of self-destruction, addiction, and abusive relationships. But just that one conversation was a turning point for her, an opportunity to view her younger self with compassion and to start to believe that healing was possible. We talked about the other elements of the C-Sense framework, and finally feeling seen, heard, and validated, she was able to rebuild her life, getting sober, learning to love her body, and to qualify as a personal trainer. So you see, it doesn't need to be complicated. And this framework, it's flexible. It can be used one-to-one or in groups, or it can be even used in organisations. It can be used to train healthcare professionals so that they can look at how they manage stress differently, and it can protect them from burnout. We can even use this framework on ourselves. You don't need to be a therapist or a doctor to listen to each other with compassion, or to empower each other to be curious about how our bodies and behaviours responding to trauma from the past. I know that if I'd known any of this, I would have treated myself and countless other patients and everyone around me completely differently. We all have the power to heal. None of this is rocket science, but it does require action. The human and financial cost of ignoring trauma is catastrophic. But the first step to changing that, simply acknowledging it with compassion, is free. Thank you.